Welcome to Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. It's a very complicated and very dangerous world we live in, and perhaps the fight or conflict that's most complicated right now and is emblematic of how difficult it is to come to terms with the current balance of forces in the world is what's going on in Syria. Just about everybody in the planet that has any real geopolitical power has their finger in that pie. Of course, the people who are paying the consequences in their tens and hundreds of thousands are the Syrian people. But we're going to try to get more of a handle on what's happening, and we're going to do it through the prism of understanding Iran and their interests in the region. And through that, looking at the issue of oil and U.S. foreign policy. And now joining us to talk about all of this in the studio is Cyrus Bina. Cyrus was born in Tehran. He was an activist against the Shah. He left during the Shah regime for the United States in 1971. He continued his activism against the Shah while he was here. He's now a distinguished research professor of economics at the University of Minnesota Morris. He's the author of several books, including the latest, A Prelude to the Foundation of Political Economy, Oil, War, and Global Polity. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. So it's a rather complicated story. It's crazily complicated, really. I suppose maybe pre-World War I, when people were trying to figure out whether there was going to be a world war and all the various interests colluding. I mean, in retrospect, decades later, you know, we can kind of understand the big picture of the uneven development of these big countries and how they started to conflict coming out of colonialism and so on. When you're in the middle of it, maybe it wasn't quite so clear, but certainly now we're at a period of transition, as you've described, from a time when the United States could control the world, where really we're a kind of hegemon, where many, many governments were virtually puppets, to a time where it's a more complex relationship between American dominant power, but perhaps, as you've described, not hegemonic power, far more rivalries, and it's very much being expressed in Syria. But if one looks at Iran and their role in this, talk a little bit about the Iranian interest in why they have decided for quite some time to stay entrenched in their support for Assad in Syria. What really is in it for them?
Yes, this is a very great question. Actually, we have to refresh our memories when the Iran-Iraq war was going on, right after the revolution. And there were so many factors which made the Islamic Republic as we know it, established Islamic Republic. Taking the embassy, for instance, is one of them, which of course created the sanctions. And then of course, the image of anti-imperialist of the regime as a populist element to be used to re-establish or establish the Islamic Republic, because the revolution was not about Khomeini, for instance. It was a revolution, and there was a counter-revolution in my judgment.
So this is the revolution in 1979, which was a broad front of the Iranian people, which included Islamists, but also leftists, communists, socialists, nationalists.
Exactly.
Except in the end, the Islamists win and actually kill off many of the leftists.
Exactly. And then the question was the deal, if you will, of Guadeloupe Conference between the people who really handled Khomeini, even though Khomeini was not preferred to the Shah. When the loss of the Shah, which was very unique, the very important son of Pax Americana, if you will, that there was no alternative. You know, the United States shifted to the other elements of the National Front, which of course they couldn't really handle that. Bakhtiar moved to really go with the Shah, as you remember, probably. And then the other side of the National Front moved to Khomeini. So there was division, total division between that. This is a secular movement division. And in that fundamental sense, the taking over of the embassy and then Iran-Iraq war established the counter-revolutionary forces of Khomeini. That was a so-called new revolution, if you will. So that's the regime. If you accept this premise, then Iran-Iraq war is extremely important. And Iran-Iraq war actually created a condition in the region that every Arab country, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, all these sheikdoms of the Persian Gulf went against Iran. And of course, Iraq was at the very head of it. And then the only regime which supported Iran was Bashar al-Assad of Syria. So this is a payback time,
now
if you will.
You've talked a lot in your work about the importance of understanding oil to understand everything else.
Yes.
So how does
because oil was globalized first. This is the first sector of the economy to be globalized, transnationalized, beyond the border of the nation state. That's why.
So how does oil play into this alliance where almost all the Arab regimes back the Iraq war against Iran? What's the underlying economics of that vis-a-vis oil?
Yes. To know that, we have to go back to the oil crisis of 1973-74, which led to the decartelization of oil. The International Petroleum Cartel was imploded, gone in 1972, and then the crisis set in, and then oil was globalized.
And by that, you mean the American control?
The American control, exactly, because there was an umbilical cord of the U.S. foreign policy to the cartelized oil. Not oil, cartelized oil was cut. So in that fundamental sense, this direct dial was gone.
It's 73, 74.
73, 74.
Creation of OPEC.
73, 74, OPEC was there. OPEC was created in 1960, but OPEC becomes OPEC, really, with some teeth during this process of globalization. And then, therefore, it was inhaled by the globalization. That's why OPEC could not set prices. And then, of course, a spot market and futures market, all these things was coming about to establish the globalization of oil. In other words, unified pricing at the global level with minimal control, if you will, from OPEC.
Go back to this issue of the Iraq-Iran war and why all the Arab countries support the isolation of Iran.
Right.
And now, how much of it has to do with just they're opposed to the Iranian Revolution? They don't like the fact that a monarchy gets overthrown. Isn't that enough reason?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The question was, first of all, the so-called green light of the United States, if you will, for the time being, because they cannot get the Shah. So why not nationalists? Why not the leftists and so forth? Why the Brzezinski's thesis of the green, around, what do you call it, the Islam, around the Soviet Union? At that time, Soviet Union existed. But why that sort of foundation was established, that Khomeini could be seen in a favorable light, comes from the policies of the United States and Carter administration and Brzezinski's thesis, about that sort of thing against the Soviets. So the international politics comes in. And of course, we are talking about regional arguments.
But if I would guess there's kind of two motivations for the Arab countries supporting the Iraq against Iran. Number one is they hate the idea that the monarchy gets overthrown, and they want to overthrow the overthrowers of the monarchy.
Yes.
But is it also to try to isolate Iran and in terms of taking their oil? I mean, how does oil figure into this piece of it? Do they want the Iranian oil to be off the market? They really just want this regime overthrown?
There were two arguments here. The argument that they were afraid of the monarchy will be overthrown because the monarchy in Iran was overthrown. And of course, when you look at the Nixon doctrine, the two pillars or those gendarmes of the Persian Gulf were Iran and Saudi Arabia. So that would figure that out.
And Israel.
And Israel, of course, is a different one. It's like a Persian Gulf, not the entire region. Of course, you're right, absolutely. Now, the question of oil is figuring out that how oil revenues will be distributed. So therefore, if during this war, if Iranians could not produce more oil, which they did, they just bombed all these platforms and so on and so forth during the war, so that Iranians should be submitted and could be submitted to say, yes, uncle, that's they say, Uncle, that's what it is, So in that sense, they did it in such a, very brutal way. The only country which came to the rescue or had a relationship with the Islamic Republic was Syria. And everybody else were trying to push and shove. And then, if you remember, in 1986 or so, when Saudis, for the first time and the last time, they turned the oil They increase the level of oil, the volume of oil, to create crisis against their own interest. In other words, if you increase the supply of oil beyond the capacity, and capacity is not just turning the spigot of oil and something like that. There are technical issues and so forth. They lost the quality of production from their own oil wells by doing that. They lost the revenue, Saudis, during the Reagan, 1986.
A commodities trader here in New York today said, "Put on your hard hat, the sky is falling." That comment came as oil prices tumble toward their lowest level since the late 1970s.
Critics say consumers aren't benefiting from lower costs because the oil industry is just being greedy. But the oil industry says change in prices takes time.
So in that sense, they were killing two birds with one shot. In other words, the Iranians didn't have enough money if the price of oil comes down. And price of oil came down, if I'm not mistaken, it's the top of my head, $32 to $9 or so. And in that sense, Iranians couldn't get enough revenue. And therefore, in that sense, war effort can be, against the Iranians and for Saddam Hussein.
Well, what's the relationship between the Saudis and the Shah of Iran?
It was lukewarm but cordial, if you will, as I remember at that time, and so forth.
So this contradiction with the Saudis and Iran now is really about a regime that overthrew the monarchy rather than some inherent fight between another oil power.
That's right. There was no inherent fight about the oil powers, no, at that time. So in that sense, the second idea, which decreased the price of oil to $9, hit the Iranians at the heart. And then at the same time, simultaneously, this is funny, during the Reagan administration, that most of the oil fields in Oklahoma went out of business. And this is the connection. When I say globalization, you do something and then unintended consequences will be happening halfway around the globe.
Well, similar to what's happening with the price of oil now. The Saudis have allowed production to go up and oil prices to go down.
But not beyond the capacity of ruining the oil fields that at that time they did. This is at the capacity. And then Saudi Arabia really had deficit a year and a half after that, because they were buying arms and everything else. They didn't have enough money, Saudi Arabia. They were hit. So in that sense, going against their own interests.
In order to weaken the Iranian regime.
In order to work with Reagan administration, they were asked by the Reagan administration to do so.
So if we go ahead today, now I understand Syria was the only one that supported them in the Iran-Iraq war. But geopolitics is geopolitics. It's pretty pragmatic. And loyalty and all these things, they don't really matter all that much when it comes down to hard national interest. What does Syria do for Iran now? I mean, why and would they really, now that they're starting to make this deal with the U.S., does that interest in keeping the Assad regime, or I should say a pro-Iranian regime in Syria, of such value to them?
I think it is almost parallel with how Putin sees Syria. It's very important that the interest of Iran will be preserved, in the sense that there's a contradiction with Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, these GCC, so-called GCC in the Persian Gulf, on the one hand. And at the same time, there's a contradiction with Israel, on the other hand, which we didn't talk about. This is 800-pound gorilla in the room, So Syria matters. That's very important for Iran. And then loyalty of Iran, Iranian regime. You see, they owe to Syria for that war.
Well, when you talk about Israel, I mean, is it Syria that matters, or is it Hezbollah that matters, and thus Syria matters?
That's another matter.
Because Syria was no threat to Israel. The only force that was really standing up to Israel was Hezbollah.
That's right. That you're opening up another front. In other words, how Hezbollah was established by Iranian, Sepah Pastaran, the Quds Force, and so on and so forth. This was done earlier, in 1982 or so, during the war. So it's a whole package that we are talking about. You cannot separate Hezbollah from the from the viewpoint of Iranians, I mean, the regime itself and Syria. So it's a package altogether. So it should be seen altogether.
Now, we're focusing now on Iran, and of course, we will get to U.S. interest and U.S. policy there, which clearly is to stay as dominant as they possibly can within all of these moving parts for their own narrow interests. But right now, we're focusing on Iran, and with all of these countries, you know, to really understand foreign policy, you have to understand domestic politics.
Absolutely.
And I think you made an interesting point in one of your works, was the extent to which the sanctions against Iran strengthened the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and how much that changed the political culture, and I would guess also foreign policy of Iran. Talk a bit about that.
Absolutely. I think the establishment of the Islamic Republic, as I mentioned, there are few factors got to be coming to be combined with the existing conditions at the time to establish the counter-revolutionary government of Iran. I said counter-revolutionary because original revolution was a different story. In that particular sense, we can see how this question of Iran-Iraq war and then how it is extended to become 8-year war would have impact on that. And then in terms of regional situations, all these Arab countries in the Persian Gulf pile up against Iran. This is another question. So the contradictory process can be seen from that sort of thing. And then Revolutionary Guards were very important at the time because Iranian government was worried about the coup d'etat, as they say. 1953 coup d'etat, this is a real one, of course. So that established the Revolutionary Guards. And then, of course, sectionalized the whole thing, sort of ostracized the Iranian army, which was the Shah's army, and that sort of thing. So in that particular sense, Khomeini at that time, I heard, that said that don't let these Revolutionary Guards interfere in politics. Khomeini said that, the leader of the counter-revolution. So in that particular sense, when they came out, the war ended, but at the same time, the sanctions was established early on in 1980, late 80s, against the embassy, takeover of the embassy and so forth. Then all these Revolutionary Guards monopolize the economy gradually, monopolize the judiciary, monopolize every aspect of the society with the Basijis, which was another force, which is lesser force, but of course...
These are the guys riding around on motorcycles.
Exactly, that's what we
clubbing demonstrators and such.
So in this particular sense, they prop up these Revolutionary Guards to become part and parcel of Iranian economy, Iranian society, and if you will, civil society of Iran, if there is any...
Because they use their sort of military political clout and sanctions as the rationale to enforce their whole role. It becomes more like the role of Pakistani army.
That's right. That's why I say that during Ahmadinejad and the riots in Iran and so forth, the second term of Ahmadinejad, the nature of the Iranian regime has changed because the qualitative change has happened during the process of Revolutionary Guards become part and parcel of society, production, economy, judiciary, everything else.
And the rationale for all of this is we stand up to the United States.
Right, absolutely, because we are isolated, we are also beleaguered by these things. These are sanctions, what can we do? And then they interfered in the economy and then created monopoly, if you will.
And the more the Americans huff and puff against the Iran, the stronger the Revolutionary Guard hand gets.
Exactly. And now the Obama administration, some of the elements in the Obama administration, they are acknowledging that the sanctions couldn't really do anything, but of course sanctions did. All kinds of things. One of the actions, one of the tasks, if you will, intended or unintended, was to create the paramilitary state in Iran.
If the Iranian regime, and it seems to me most of them, are very interested in making money, and if you wanted to have a fairly easy life and make lots of money, and you could still, one would think, have your theocracy, you would join the American umbrella.
Exactly.
Sell your oil, give up on Hezbollah, give up on Syria, play nice with Israel, and make money.
Yeah.
and live happily ever after. The problem, I guess, is if you do that, then you unleash all the internal forces that would like to overthrow you. And so you need the nationalist card.
Right, but you see, the sequence of history is not as rosy as we can predict. Iran-Iraq war is more than Iran-Iraq war. That was huge. In other words, that was a prehistory of the history, present history, if you will. So in that sense, it happened. We cannot wish it away. And that, with the embassy takeover, created sanctions. And then the arrogance, if you will, of the United States policy, rather than thinking through. That's why I say that this is a time of decline of the United States, if you will. But that's a different story.
Let me just add one thing here, and tell me if I'm right. You know, once you have the revolution against the Shah, you can't just play nice with the Americans, exactly, because it will be a betrayal of the people. And this is the factor here, is that the Iranian people were revolutionary. The Iranian people overthrew the Shah. And you have to keep taking that into account if you're ruling Iran, because you yourself will get overthrown.
Exactly. Takeover of the embassy was done spontaneously, as you probably, if you go back to the history. But about a day or two, Khomeini said yes to them, to the so-called students. In other words, they used it in such a way to show that they are anti-imperialist, if you will, quote unquote, and anti-American, if you will, for the domestic purposes, to establish the Islamic Republic. Islamic Republic was not established really at that time. I mean, it was in a flux. So in that sense, you see there how the question of sanctions created something which is a monster, actually contradicted itself. And then Iran-Iraq war as well.
All right, thanks for joining us.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for joining us on Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network.